2 weeks before the biggest fight in boxing history, a mob boss walked into Muhammad Ali's hotel room with a briefcase containing $1 million in cash. All Ali had to do was lose. He said no. What happened after that decision was buried in classified FBI files for 47 years, and it nearly cost him his life. There are moments in life when a man is tested. Not in front of cameras, not under bright lights, not when the crowd is cheering his name, but alone, in a quiet hotel room, with a decision that could cost him everything. 2 weeks before the biggest fight in boxing history, Muhammad Ali heard a knock on his hotel door. That knock would change everything, and for 47 years, almost nobody knew what really happened next. March 1971, New York City was electric. Posters were everywhere. Newspapers called it the fight of the century. Two undefeated champions, two proud men, one world title, Muhammad Ali, Joe Frazier, the entire planet was watching. But behind the scenes, something darker was moving. Ali was staying at the New Yorker hotel. High floor, tight security. Training hard every day. He had already lost 3 years of his career after refusing to fight in Vietnam. He had already been stripped of his title. He had already been called a traitor. Now he was back, hungry, focused, determined to prove he was still the greatest. That afternoon, he had just finished training, sweat still on his face, tape around his hands. Angelo Dundee, his trainer, reviewing strategy. They were laughing. Ali was relaxed. Then came the knock. Not loud, not aggressive, just steady. Ali's security opened the door. Two men stood there, expensive suits, polished shoes, expressions that did not smile. One was short and thick-built, eyes cold, face calm in a way that didn't feel calm at all. The other stood behind him, silent, watching. The short man spoke first. "Mr. Ali, my name is Carmine Galante. I need 5 minutes of your time." Angelo Dundee froze. He knew that name. In New York, everyone knew that name. Galante wasn't just a businessman. He was a powerful figure in organized gambling, a man connected to very serious people, a man who did not hear no very often. Ali didn't step back. "Whatever you have to say," Ali replied calmly, "you can say it in front of my people." Galante smiled, but there was no warmth in it. He walked inside, closed the door, and placed a black briefcase on the bed. The room went silent. He opened it slowly. Stacks of cash. Neat, organized, thick bundles of $100 bills. More money than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. $1 million, Galante said quietly. In 1971, that wasn't just money. That was power, security, generational wealth. Ali looked at the cash, then at the man. "And what do I have to do for that?" Ali asked. Galante's eyes didn't blink. "Lose the fight." The words landed heavy. No shouting, no drama, just a simple transaction. Lose to Frazier. Go down late in the fight. Make it look real. Walk away rich. "Frazier's going to win anyway," Galante continued calmly. "You've been out of boxing 3 years. He's in his prime. Take the smart payday." The room felt smaller. Ali's sparring partner stared at the floor. Angelo's face went pale. This wasn't a suggestion, this was an offer most men never refused. Ali closed the briefcase slowly. "I don't take money to lose," he said. Galante's smile disappeared. "You don't understand," he said softly. "This isn't a negotiation. This is generosity." The air changed. "You have family," Galante continued. "Children, a future." Ali's fists tightened. "Are you threatening me?" Galante tilted his head. "I'm explaining reality." The message was clear. If Ali refused, there would be consequences. He had 2 weeks to reconsider. Then Galante stood up, picked up the briefcase, and walked out. No shouting, no drama. Just quiet danger. As soon as the door shut, Angelo Dundee exploded. "Champ, do you know who that was?" Ali stayed calm. "I know what he wanted." "People who say no to that man don't do well," Angelo said. "You don't say no to men like that." Ali looked straight ahead. "I didn't fight my way back for 3 years, just to lose on purpose." Angelo lowered his voice. "They could ruin you." Ali's response was simple. Then they ruin me. He paused. But they won't make me a coward first. That night, Angelo made a phone call, a quiet one to someone he trusted. Within hours, federal agents were informed, because this wasn't just about boxing anymore. It was about something bigger. The FBI had been watching Delonte for years. They suspected gambling control, match fixing, quiet influence over sporting events, but they never had proof. Now they had a window. The next morning, two agents approached Ali discreetly. They didn't wear badges. They didn't make a scene. They spoke quietly. "Mr. Ali," one said, "we believe your life may be in danger." Ali didn't flinch. How much danger? Serious. If Galante had millions placed on Frazier, and Ali refused to cooperate, and then Ali won, it would cost powerful people a fortune. Men had been destroyed for less. The agent leaned forward. "We want you to fight." Ali blinked. "You want to use me? We want to protect you while we document criminal activity." There was silence. Ali thought about it. Then slowly, he smiled. "You want to catch them?" "Yes." Ali leaned back. "Then let's catch them." From that moment on, everything changed. But nobody knew. Not the media. Not the fans. Not even most of Ali's team. Agents disguised as hotel staff. Cars checked before every drive. Food inspected. Training facilities swept. Ali was no longer just preparing for a boxing match. He was living like a marked man, and 3 days before the fight, the second message came, slipped under his door. No signature, just one sentence. Ali read it, crumpled it, threw it in the trash. But that night, at 2 a.m., security discovered something chilling in the hotel parking garage, under Ali's limousine, a device meant to cause serious destruction. It was disarmed quietly, no press, no headlines. The public never knew. But now it wasn't just an offer anymore. It was pressure. Real pressure. Ali was moved to a secure location, transported quietly, escorted without drawing attention. He trained in silence. He slept in safe houses, all while the world believed he was just hyping a fight. Imagine that, the loudest man in sports, living in total secrecy, and still showing up to press conferences, smiling, still predicting victory, still calling himself the greatest. No one knew he might not even make it to the ring alive. March 8th, Madison Square Garden. The arena was packed. Celebrities, politicians, cameras, 300 million people watching worldwide. Ali stepped into the building, but he wasn't alone. Federal agents positioned throughout the crowd, watching every entrance, every hallway, every shadow. In his dressing room, one final message arrived. "You made your choice." Ali stared at it, then looked at himself in the mirror. No fear in his eyes, only calm. "Let's go fight." That night, he fought 15 brutal rounds. He went down in the 15th. He stood back up, and he lost, fair and square. But here's the twist. He lost honestly. He didn't throw it. He didn't fold. He didn't sell his soul. And because of that, something bigger was set in motion. The public saw a fight, but behind the scenes, a war had just begun. And over the next few months, there would be more attempts to silence him, more pressure, more danger. But Ali had already made his choice. And once he made a choice, he never backed down. That was just the beginning. Because the real story, the part hidden for 47 years, was only getting started. The world believed Muhammad Ali had lost the fight of the century. They saw 15 brutal rounds. They saw Ali rise from the canvas and finish on his feet. They saw defeat. What they didn't see was that the real fight had only just begun. Because when the crowd went home, when the headlines were printed, when the lights inside Madison Square Garden shut off, the danger didn't disappear. It got closer. Ali was in his dressing room after the fight, his face swollen, his body exhausted. Ice pressed against his jaw. Joe Frazier had won fairly. No tricks, no setup. Ali had refused the money. He had fought honestly. He had kept his word. A quiet knock interrupted the room. 2 FBI agents stepped inside. Their faces were serious. "We picked up 3 men tonight," one of them said. Ali looked up slowly. 3. The agent nodded. One tried to enter the building with a weapon. Another was caught backstage with a substance we believe was meant for your water bottle. The third was outside near your vehicle. Ali didn't speak. The room felt colder than it had 2 weeks ago when Galante first opened that briefcase. Connections? Ali asked. All three tied to the same organization, Galante. The fight had ended. But someone still wanted insurance. Ali leaned back against the locker. He had lost the title that night, but now he understood something deeper. This was never just about a bet, it was about control. And he had refused to be controlled. The FBI increased protection immediately, not publicly, never publicly. Ali was too famous for that, too visible. If the public found out he was under federal protection, panic would follow. Instead, protection became invisible. Agents rotated through his entourage, some as event staff, some as hotel security. Ali couldn't even tell who was real and who wasn't anymore. He laughed about it once. Maybe one of you is undercover too, he joked to his own team. But deep down, he understood. This wasn't temporary. This was serious. 2 weeks after the fight, Ali traveled to Miami. He was trying to move forward, trying to prepare for what came next in his career. But the threat followed him. One afternoon, during a routine training session at a small gym, something unusual happened. An agent approached Angelo quietly. There's a man on the rooftop across the street. Angelo's stomach dropped. Within minutes, plainclothes officers were moving carefully. The man was detained without a scene. No shouting, no sirens. Inside his bag, a high-powered rifle. Clear line of sight into the gym. Ali had been hitting the heavy bag when it happened. He never even knew. Later that night, the agents told him they caught him before anything happened. Ali sat in silence, then asked only one question. Who sent him? The agent hesitated. He says he doesn't know. But everyone knew. The organization didn't like unfinished business, and Ali had embarrassed them. He hadn't taken the money, he hadn't folded. He hadn't feared them. Men like Galante built reputations on power. If one man publicly refused and survived, that reputation cracked, and power without fear is just money. In April, something even more chilling occurred. Ali was staying at a hotel during a promotional appearance. Late in the evening, room service arrived. Standard tray. Covered plates. Ali was hungry. He had just finished interviews. As he reached for the food, an agent stopped him. Just a minute. The tray was taken away, tested. Within an hour, confirmation came back. The food had been tampered with. Quietly, carefully, not enough to raise suspicion immediately, but enough to cause serious harm. The food service worker who prepared it was never found. Ali sat alone after hearing the news. No cameras, no microphones, no crowd. Just him and the reality of it all. He could have taken the money, he could have gone down in round 12, he could have walked away rich and safe. Instead, he was sleeping under protection, eating monitored meals, watching shadows. Did he regret it? No, but that didn't mean he wasn't tired. 3 months passed like this. Constant movement, constant tension. Ali started noticing things. Unmarked cars that stayed too long, strangers watching from lobbies, clicks on phone lines. The FBI reassured him repeatedly. We're building something bigger, they told him. We need patience. They were tracking finances, wire transfers, associates, connections between gambling rings and fight outcomes. Ali's refusal had given them leverage. Galante had become impatient. And impatient men make mistakes. That was what the FBI was waiting for. One mistake too many, but organized power doesn't retreat quietly. In May, while driving to a charity event, Ali's car was suddenly forced off the road. No major crash, but enough to shake the vehicle violently. The other driver sped away. Witnesses saw part of a license plate. The vehicle was later traced back to a stolen car from a neighborhood heavily connected to Galante's network. It was never officially linked, but it didn't need to be. The message was clear. You're still being watched. Through all of it, Ali never spoke publicly, not once. He didn't complain. He didn't reveal threats. He didn't accuse anyone. He showed up to interviews smiling. He joked. He predicted comebacks. He called himself the greatest, and maybe that frustrated them even more, because fear was their weapon, and he wasn't showing any. 6 months after the fight, the FBI called a private meeting. Mr. Ali, one of the lead agents, said, "We're close." Close meant indictments. Close meant enough evidence to move forward. But it also meant something else. The protection detail would slowly step back, not disappear, but reduce. Ali understood. "You can't guard me forever," he said. "No," the agent admitted, "but what you did started something that matters." And it did. Because behind the scenes, investigations were tightening. Associates were being questioned. Records were being pulled. Pressure was building quietly. Galante didn't know exactly how much the FBI had. But he knew something was different. The man he tried to buy had turned into a symbol, not just of athletic greatness, but of resistance. In October 1971, Carmine Galante was arrested, not publicly connected to Ali, not officially tied to the fight, but charged on serious racketeering counts, financial crimes, illegal gambling operations. The case built quietly. Ali watched from a distance. He didn't celebrate, he didn't speak. He simply nodded when he heard. Justice doesn't always come loudly. Sometimes it arrives slowly, silently, through paperwork instead of headlines. Galante would later return to organized crime after serving time, and years later his story would end violently in a Brooklyn restaurant. But by then, Ali had already won the fight that mattered most. For decades, the public knew none of this. The bribe, the threats, the attempts, the protection, all classified, locked away in federal files. Ali never told the story, even to close friends. He carried it quietly. Why? Because sometimes courage isn't about telling people what you survived. It's about surviving it without needing applause. Years later, after Ali passed away, declassified files revealed fragments of the truth. Agents finally spoke. Historians were stunned. This wasn't rumor, it wasn't exaggeration. It was documented. The bribe was real. The pressure was real. The protection was real. And the attempts were very real. Ali had stepped into that ring at Madison Square Garden knowing powerful men wanted him gone, and he fought anyway. He lost the match. But he kept his integrity. And in doing so, he exposed something bigger than a fixed fight. He exposed the limits of power, because money can buy silence, it can buy fear, it can buy cooperation, but it cannot buy a man who has already decided who he is. And here's the part that matters most. Ali had already sacrificed 3 years of his prime for his beliefs when he refused the Vietnam draft. He knew what it meant to stand alone. He knew what it meant to be criticized. He knew what it meant to lose everything publicly. So when a man in a suit placed $1 million on his bed, Ali wasn't just refusing money, he was protecting something he valued more: his name, his soul, his legacy. The world remembers March 8, 1971 as the night Joe Frazier defeated Muhammad Ali. But history remembers something deeper. It remembers a man who stood firm when nobody was watching, who chose principle over protection, who refused to bend when bending would have been easier. The mob tried to buy him. They tried to scare him, but they could not own him. And that is why the real fight of the century wasn't in the ring. It was in that hotel room, when a briefcase opened, and a man said, "No." The danger slowly faded, but the silence stayed. That was the part nobody talks about. Because when threats stop, when headlines move on, the mind doesn't just reset. Muhammad Ali went back to training, back to interviews, back to smiling in front of cameras. But something inside him had shifted. He had always been fearless, but now he understood something deeper about fear. It doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it waits. After the investigation tightened and arrests were made, the FBI reduced his protection, not completely, but enough that Ali began traveling normally again, at least on the outside. He was back on planes, back in arenas, back in crowded hotels, back around strangers. But there were moments, small moments, where he paused. If a knock came late at night, if a car lingered too long, if footsteps echoed behind him in a hallway. For a split second, his mind went back to that briefcase, to that cold smile, to that note under the door. You made your choice. Yes, he had. And he would make it again. But courage does not mean you don't feel pressure. It means you move forward anyway. Angelo Dundee noticed it first. One evening after training, Angelo sat next to Ali in the gym. "You okay, champ?" he asked casually. Ali kept wrapping his hands. "I'm fine." But Angelo had known him for years. There was a slight difference now. Ali was sharper, more watchful, less careless, not afraid, just aware. Ali looked up. "You ever think about how easy it would have been?" Angelo didn't need clarification. "The money?" he asked quietly. Ali nodded. $1 million just to fall down. He stopped wrapping his hands. But then what? That was the part that mattered. What happens after you sell something you can't buy back? Fights can be lost and won. Titles can come and go. But once your name is questioned, once your integrity cracks, you never get that back. Ali understood something that night most men never learn. Easy money costs the most. The public still debated the fight. Some said Ali wasn't the same after his 3-year ban. Some said Frazier was simply stronger. Some criticized, some defended. But none of them knew the full weight Ali carried into that ring. He didn't just walk in as a challenger. He walked in as a man who had refused power, refused protection, refused comfort, and still chose to fight honestly, even knowing that if he won, it might cost him more than the title. That kind of pressure doesn't show on a scorecard, but it shows in a man's character. Months later, during a small private dinner, one of the retired agents spoke openly to Ali for the first time. "You know," the agent said, "most people in your position would have taken it." Ali raised an eyebrow. "Most people ain't me." The agent smiled. "That's true." But then he added something important. "When you refused, you changed the entire investigation. You forced movement. You made them nervous." Ali leaned back. "Good. Because here's something powerful. When corruption expects obedience and receives resistance instead, it panics. And panic creates mistakes. Ali's refusal didn't just protect his name, it destabilized a network that relied on silent cooperation. He had broken the pattern. And men who build power on fear hate broken patterns. But even as justice slowly unfolded behind the scenes, Ali's career moved forward. He fought again, he lost again, he won again. His rivalry with Frazier deepened. Their battles became legendary. The Thriller in Manila, the rematches, the war of words. History remembers the punches. But beneath it all, there was something else driving Ali now. He had faced something outside the ring, something quiet, something invisible. And he had stood firm after that left hook didn't seem so terrifying. Years passed. Life moved on. Galante's story ended violently in 1979, taken down not by law enforcement but by his own world. That's how those stories often end. But Ali never spoke about the hotel room, never mentioned the briefcase, never told reporters about the threats. Why? Because he didn't need credit. He didn't need applause. He had already proven who he was to himself, and that's the only audience that truly matters. In private conversations years later, when someone asked him if he was ever scared, Ali gave a simple answer. "I'm human." That's it. He didn't pretend he felt nothing. He didn't claim invincibility. He felt the weight. He felt the pressure. But he also understood something deeper. Fear is temporary, and he refused to live with regret. When the FBI files were finally declassified decades later, historians were stunned. Documents confirmed the bribe attempt, the quiet moves behind the scenes. For 47 years, the public had no idea Ali had never used it to build his legend, never used it to gain sympathy, never used it to elevate himself. He simply moved forward, and that might be the most powerful part of this story, because in a world where people shout about every struggle, Ali carried his quietly. Joe Frazier passed away never knowing the full truth. He believed he beat Ali fair and square, and he did. Ali fought honestly. That's what makes the story even more remarkable. Ali didn't refuse the bribe because he thought he would win. He refused it because winning wasn't the point. Character was. He lost the fight. But he kept his name clean, and that victory lasts longer than any belt. There's something else people don't talk about. Ali had already sacrificed 3 prime years for refusing the draft. He had already been punished for standing on principle, so when another moment came, another offer to compromise, he didn't hesitate. Because once you decide who you are, decisions get easier. Hard, but clearer. Think about it. Alone in a hotel room, a briefcase full of life-changing money, a powerful man hinting at consequences. No cameras, no crowd, no applause waiting. Just choice. That's where legacy is built, not in stadiums. In silence, Ali once said, "A man who has no imagination has no wings." But imagination works both ways. He could imagine the money. He could imagine the comfort. He could imagine walking away rich and untouched. But he could also imagine looking in the mirror afterward, and that image was unacceptable. Years later, when asked if he regretted losing that first fight to Frazier, he smiled. "I lost the fight," he said, "but I kept my soul." Because power isn't measured in victories alone, it's measured in what you refuse. Refuse to compromise, refuse to surrender, refuse to sell. The world remembers Ali for his speed, his mouth, his confidence. But the greatest thing about Muhammad Ali wasn't how hard he punched, it was how firmly he stood. When money knocked, when danger whispered, when pressure surrounded him quietly. He didn't bend, he didn't fold, he didn't break. And most importantly, he didn't need anyone to know. That's what makes this story powerful. It wasn't public courage, it wasn't dramatic rebellion, it was private integrity. And private integrity is the rarest kind, because nobody is watching, nobody is clapping, nobody is rewarding you. You choose it anyway. The fight of the century ended with Ali on the canvas, but the real victory happened 2 weeks earlier, when a briefcase opened, and he closed it, when a powerful man hinted at consequences, and he said no, when silence could have protected him, and integrity guided him instead. Some men win titles, some men win money, some men win fame. Muhammad Ali won something harder. He won against compromise, and that is a fight most people never even enter. Because at the end of life, the applause fades, the belts gather dust, the crowds disappear, but your name stays. And Ali protected his, at any cost. Sometimes it looks like discipline, it looks like patience, it looks like becoming untouchable in a way your enemies never expected. After the threats faded, after the investigations quieted, after the protection detail stepped back, Muhammad Ali didn't celebrate. He didn't expose anyone. He didn't even hint at what he had survived. Instead, he did something far more dangerous. He rebuilt himself. Losing to Joe Frazier hurt. Ali would never pretend it didn't. He had called himself the greatest. He had predicted victory. He had promised dominance, and that night, under the bright lights of Madison Square Garden, he was humbled. But here's what most people misunderstand. That loss did not weaken him. It sharpened him. Because when you survive something bigger than defeat, defeat stops feeling like the worst thing that can happen. Ali had already stared down power behind closed doors. He had already rejected a fortune. He had already lived months knowing shadows were following him. So losing a fight, that was pain, but it wasn't fear, and when a man stops fearing loss, he becomes extremely difficult to control. In the months after the fight of the century, Ali trained with a different kind of focus. Angelo Dundee noticed it immediately. "Champ," Angelo said one afternoon, watching Ali move around the ring, "you're different." Ali smirked. "Different good or different bad?" "Different strong." Ali didn't respond right away. He kept moving, faster now, sharper. There was no wasted motion, no lazy showboating. It was as if something inside him had locked into place. The bribe attempt had taught him something powerful. They can threaten your safety. They can threaten your life. But they cannot threaten your character unless you let them. And once he understood that, something shifted permanently. The rematch with Frazier became personal. Publicly, it was about pride, about rivalry, about unfinished business. But privately, it meant something deeper. Ali wasn't just fighting Frazier anymore. He was fighting the idea that he could be manipulated, that his career could be steered by outside hands, that powerful men could decide outcomes behind curtains. Every punch he threw carried something more than competition. It carried defiance. By the time the thriller in Manila happened in 1975, Ali had transformed, older, wiser, still loud, still charismatic, but there was steel underneath the charm now. The fight in Manila was brutal, exhausting, unforgiving. Both men pushed beyond limits. At one point, Ali leaned over and whispered to Frazier, "They told me you were bad." It wasn't mockery. It was respect. He knew real struggle. He knew what it meant to endure, and in those later fights, something else became clear. Ali wasn't fighting for approval anymore. He wasn't fighting to prove the mob wrong. He was fighting for himself, and that is the most dangerous reason to fight. But the real revenge, it wasn't physical, it wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. It was legacy, because while Galante's story ended in violence and secrecy, Ali's story grew, stronger, cleaner, more powerful. Years passed, the world changed, and Ali became more than an athlete. He became a symbol of courage, of resistance, of standing firm when standing firm costs you something. And here's the irony. The men who tried to pressure him are remembered only in footnotes. Ali is remembered everywhere. That is the quietest, most complete revenge of all. Think about it. If he had taken the money, even if nobody ever found out, he would have known. Every victory afterward would carry doubt. Every smile would hide something. Every handshake would feel heavier. He would always wonder, did I build this on compromise? Instead, he built his legacy on refusal. Refusal to bend in 1967 when he lost his title over Vietnam. Refusal to bend in 1971 when offered $1 million. Refusal to bend when threats followed. Consistency. That's what gave his name power. Not perfection. Consistency. Years later, during a college speech, Ali said something that sounded simple but carried deep meaning. Service to others is the rent you pay for your room here on earth. People applauded. They heard inspiration. But underneath that line was experience. He knew what it meant to pay a cost. He had paid it, privately, without applause. And when he spoke about principle, it was lived truth. As time passed, the files stayed sealed. The story stayed buried. Ali never corrected anyone who misunderstood 1971. He never said, "You don't know what I went through." He never demanded sympathy. He simply moved forward. Because sometimes the strongest move is silence, not weak silence, controlled silence. There's a difference. Weak silence hides fear. Ali chose the second. And yet, the pressure had changed him in ways even he didn't fully admit. He trusted fewer people. He became more protective of his circle. Not paranoid. Just aware, because once you've seen how power moves behind curtains, you never fully forget. But instead of becoming bitter, he became intentional. He used his platform carefully. He stood for causes he believed in. He traveled the world. He shook hands with leaders. He met children. He visited hospitals. He turned fame into influence. That was the real transformation. The mob tried to shrink him into a transaction. Instead, he expanded into a global icon. When the FBI files were finally opened decades later, retired agents spoke with quiet admiration. One said, "We protected him physically, but we never had to protect his courage." That line says everything, because protection can guard a body, but only a man guards his principles. And Ali guarded his fiercely. There's another layer most people miss. The bribe attempt didn't just test Ali. It tested the system. Would law enforcement move? Would corruption win quietly? Would gambling networks keep controlling outcomes? Ali's refusal forced exposure. It forced attention. Even if the public never saw it, that's impact, not loud impact, structural impact. And that kind lasts. Imagine the alternative reality. Ali takes the briefcase, he loses in round 12, he walks away rich. Maybe nobody ever finds out. But the pattern continues. More fighters pressured, more outcomes shaped, more fear controlling sport. His no interrupted that chain. You may not see the ripple, but it happened. Late in life, when Parkinson's slowed his body, when speech became difficult, when movement required effort, Ali's presence still commanded respect, not because of how fast he once was, but because of what he had stood for. People didn't see just a boxer. They saw a man who refused to compromise, over and over again. And that consistency became larger than any single fight. Revenge often looks like destruction, but sometimes it looks like endurance. The men who threatened him are remembered for power. Ali is remembered for principle. Power fades. Principle echoes. That is the ultimate reversal. The hotel room in 1971 was quiet. No cameras, no witnesses beyond a handful of people. A briefcase opened, an offer made, a choice presented. That moment never made headlines, but it shaped everything that followed. Because greatness is not defined by how you perform under lights, it is defined by how you decide in the dark. Ali decided, and he never looked back. The world called him the greatest because of his speed, because of his poetry, because of his wins. But those who knew the full story understood something deeper. He was the greatest because he could not be bought. And in a world where everything seems to have a price, that is rare. That is powerful. That is unforgettable. The mob wanted control. The FBI wanted evidence. The public wanted spectacle. Ali wanted integrity. And in the end, integrity won. Quietly, slowly, completely. There are fights the world sees. And then there are fights a man carries alone. Muhammad Ali had both. The world saw Sonny Liston fall. They saw Joe Frazier's left hook. They saw the thriller in Manila, but they never saw the hotel room. They never saw the briefcase. They never saw the quiet decision that could have changed everything. And maybe that's why this story matters so much, because it reminds us the most important victories are often invisible. As the years passed, Ali's legend grew. He became more than a boxer. He became an icon. He lit Olympic torches. He traveled the world. He stood beside presidents and children alike. People admired his speed, his humor, his confidence. But those who studied him closely noticed something deeper, a calm certainty. He no longer needed to prove anything, because the hardest test had already happened, and he had passed it. In private conversations late in life, when his voice had softened and time had slowed him down, Ali once reflected on integrity. He didn't talk about the mob, he didn't mention threats, but he said something powerful. Your hands can't hit what your eyes can't see, and your soul can't live with what your heart knows is wrong. Simple words, but heavy with meaning, because that $1 million, it would have been easy money, life-changing money, security money, but it would have followed him. Every interview, every handshake, every championship, every quiet moment before sleep, it would have whispered, "You sold something." And Ali understood something rare. Peace of mind is worth more than protection. Think about the pressure. He had already lost 3 prime years of his career over his stance on Vietnam. He had already been stripped of his title. He had already faced public criticism and isolation. Then, just as he returned, just as the biggest fight of his life approached, he was offered a shortcut, a way to win without winning, a way to secure wealth without struggle, and it came wrapped not just in cash, but in warning. Most men break under that weight. Ali didn't. Why? Because he had already decided who he was long before the offer arrived. That's the key. Character is not built in the moment of temptation. It is revealed. Ali had built his character years earlier. So when the moment came, he didn't hesitate. Joe Frazier once said after their rivalry cooled, "We were 2 fighters doing our job." And that's true. Frazier fought honestly. Ali fought honestly. But what Frazier never knew was that Ali stepped into that ring carrying more than pride. He carried a decision. He carried the knowledge that powerful men had reasons beyond sport, and he still fought fairly. That's what makes the loss powerful. He lost without compromise. That is rare. Most people will bend to avoid losing. Ali chose to lose clean rather than win dirty, and that choice shaped his legacy forever. When the FBI documents were finally released decades later, historians were stunned. Not because corruption existed, that was no surprise, but because of how close it came, how real it was, how quiet it stayed. One retired agent said in an interview, he could have protected himself by cooperating. Instead, he protected the sport. That sentence carries weight, because boxing in that era was fragile. Influence ran deep. Money flowed quietly. Ali's refusal sent a message, not publicly but internally. There were lines that couldn't be crossed, at least not with him. As his health declined later in life, people often described Ali as peaceful, humble, gentle. But beneath that gentleness was steel, the same steel that sat calmly in a hotel room in 1971 and said, no, he never needed to talk about it. He never needed credit, because he knew, and sometimes that's enough. There's something deeply human about this story. It isn't about punches, it isn't about titles, it's about choice. Every person faces moments where compromise is easier, where nobody would know, where the reward seems worth it, where the risk of refusal feels heavy. And in those moments, no crowd is watching, no applause is waiting, just silence. Ali teaches us something powerful about those silent moments. You decide who you are there, not when people are cheering, not when cameras are flashing, but when it's quiet, when temptation sits on the bed in front of you, when pressure speaks softly, when fear suggests cooperation. That's when identity is shaped. Years after the fight, someone asked Ali if he regretted anything about his career. He thought for a moment, then smiled. I did what I believed was right. Not perfect, not easy, right. And that's all any man can truly aim for. Carmine Galante's story ended in a restaurant in Brooklyn in 1979. A life of control and influence ended abruptly. Power built on fear tends to collapse that way. But Ali's story didn't end in fear. It expanded, it softened, it inspired. Schools were named after him. Charities carried his message. Children learned his quotes. He became a global ambassador of peace. The contrast is almost poetic. One man built influence through intimidation. The other built it through integrity. One story ended quietly in violence. The other continues decades after his passing. That's not coincidence. That's consequence. There's a powerful lesson hidden in all this. Revenge doesn't always require retaliation. Sometimes the greatest revenge is living so well, so honestly, that the people who tried to control you become irrelevant. Ali didn't destroy his enemies. He outgrew them. He became too big for their reach, too respected for their whispers, too principled for their pressure. That is strength beyond muscle. Imagine if the story had gone differently, if he had accepted, if he had fallen intentionally, if suspicion followed him forever. Would he still be remembered the same way? Maybe as a great boxer, but not as a symbol, not as a man of principle, not as someone who stood firm repeatedly across decades. The briefcase moment protected more than one fight. It protected his entire legacy. When he lit the Olympic torch in 1996, his hands trembling, the world saw courage of a different kind. They saw vulnerability. They saw grace. They saw strength beyond physical power. That image resonates because people believed in him. They believed in the consistency of his character. And that belief was built long before 1996. It was built in moments like that hotel room in 1971. At the end of life, titles fade. Records get broken. New champions rise. But stories endure. And this story endures because it reminds us that greatness isn't just talent, it's decision. Decision under pressure. Decision under threat. Decision without applause. Muhammad Ali fought many battles, some in the ring, some in private. But the fight he never talked about, the one against compromise, may have been the most important of all. He once said, "He who is not courageous enough to take risks will accomplish nothing in life." Most people think of that in terms of sport or ambition. But courage isn't only about taking risks to gain something. Sometimes it's about taking risks to protect something. Protect your name, protect your principles, protect your peace. Ali took that risk, and he never looked back. The world remembers March 8, 1971 as the night he lost. But history remembers something different. It remembers a man who couldn't be bought, a man who wouldn't bend, a man who understood that some victories don't come with belts, they come with self-respect. And that is worth more than $1 million. In the end, It was never about the money. It was never about the mob. It wasn't even about Joe Frazier. It was about a choice. A single, quiet, almost invisible choice. And the kind of man who makes it, close your eyes for a moment. Forget the stadium. Forget the lights. Forget the commentators screaming. Picture instead a small hotel room in New York City. A bed, a chair, a window looking down at busy streets, and a briefcase, heavy, full of cash. $1 million. Enough to change a man's life overnight, enough to erase worries, enough to secure children's futures, enough to make most people pause. Across from it, a powerful figure, calm, confident, certain that money solves everything, certain that every man has a price. And standing there, Muhammad Ali, not the greatest, not the global icon, just a man, sweaty from training, tired from preparation, facing a decision that will never make headlines. That is where the real story begins. We like to think greatness happens in big moments in front of crowds, in dramatic fashion. But the truth, greatness often happens quietly. It happens when no one would blame you for taking the easier path. It happens when compromise looks logical, when survival feels smart, when nobody would ever find out. Because here's the reality. If Ali had taken that money, the world might never have known. The fight would still have happened. He might still have lost. People would still have debated, life would have moved on. But Ali would have known, and that would have been enough. There's something powerful about that, because integrity is not about what others see, it's about what you can live with when you're alone, alone with your thoughts, alone with your reflection, alone with your conscience. That night in the hotel room, Ali wasn't thinking about headlines. He wasn't thinking about documentaries. He was thinking about who he was and who he refused to become. Money can buy comfort. It can buy silence. But it cannot buy peace. Peace comes from alignment, from knowing your actions match your values. And Ali had already paid dearly for his values. He had lost years of his prime for refusing the draft. He had been stripped of titles, mocked, criticized, doubted. He knew the cost of standing firm. So when another test arrived, he didn't panic. He recognized it. This wasn't new. It was just another version of the same question. What do you stand for? There's a reason this story stayed hidden for decades. Not because it wasn't important, but because Ali never needed it to define him. He didn't run to reporters. He didn't write a dramatic tell-all. He didn't use it to build sympathy. He kept it quiet. And that silence makes it even more powerful. Because he didn't refuse the bribe for applause, he refused it because it was wrong. Simple, clear, non-negotiable. Think about how rare that is. We live in a world where people negotiate everything. Principles become flexible. Morals become convenient. But Ali, he was consistent. He stood firm in 1967. He stood firm in 1971. He stood firm again and again. Consistency is what made him larger than boxing, because anyone can be brave once, but to be brave repeatedly, that's different. The mob believed in leverage. They believed every man bends under pressure. They believed fear is stronger than character. But they miscalculated. They assumed Ali was like everyone else. They assumed the offer was irresistible. They assumed survival mattered more than integrity. They were wrong, and that miscalculation changed everything. Because when power expects obedience and receives resistance, it loses its grip. Ali walked into Madison Square Garden knowing something most people in that arena did not. He knew powerful men were angry. He knew danger had followed him for weeks. He knew protection was watching. He knew pressure was real. And still, he stepped into the ring and fought honestly. He lost that night, but he lost clean. And there is dignity in that. There is strength in that. There is something unbreakable in that. Imagine carrying that weight into a fight, not just physical preparation, but emotional pressure, not just competition, but consequence, and still performing at the highest level. That is mental strength beyond sport. That is inner stability. That is knowing who you are so clearly that no outside force can shake it. Years later, when his hands trembled lighting the Olympic torch, the world saw vulnerability. But what they were really seeing was endurance. The same endurance that said no in 1971. The same endurance that survived threats quietly. The same endurance that protected his name. Because strength isn't just speed and power, it's conviction. Conviction that survives time. There's something else about this story, something subtle. Ali didn't just protect himself, he protected the sport. If he had folded, if corruption had succeeded quietly, the message would have been clear. Champions can be bought. Outcomes can be steered. Integrity is optional. Instead, he sent a different message. Not loudly, but clearly. There are lines you cannot cross with me. And that matters, because when one person stands firm, it forces systems to adjust. It forces darkness into light, even if only slightly. Carmine Galante's life ended in a restaurant in Brooklyn. A world built on control, eventually turned inward. But Ali's world expanded. Schools, foundations, global admiration, children repeating his quotes decades later. Which legacy would you choose? Short-term power or long-term respect? Ali chose respect, even when it cost him comfort. At the end of life, when records blur and statistics fade, people remember stories, and this story carries a lesson deeper than boxing. Every person faces a briefcase moment, maybe not with cash stacked inside, maybe not with a mob figure across the room, but in some form, an opportunity to compromise, to bend, to take the easier path, to justify it quietly. And in that moment, you decide who you are. Ali's story reminds us that character is not built in comfort. It's built in tension, in uncertainty, in risk, and in silence. He once said, "Impossible is nothing." Most people interpret that as confidence, but maybe it also means something else. Maybe it means it's not impossible to stand firm, not impossible to refuse temptation, not impossible to choose integrity over ease. It's difficult, yes, but not impossible. And he proved that. There's an image I want you to hold on to. The briefcase closing, Ali's hand resting on it. The decision made. No shouting, no drama, just a calm refusal. That calmness is powerful because it shows something important. He didn't hesitate. He didn't debate long. He didn't calculate risk versus reward like a businessman. He already knew the answer. And when you already know who you are, decisions become clear. The fight of the century is remembered as a loss, but the $1 million decision, that was a victory, a private victory, a moral victory, a permanent victory, because even though he fell to the canvas in the 15th round, he never fell in that hotel room, and that's the round that mattered most. If you take anything fraught, own this story, let it be this. Success without integrity is fragile. Integrity without success is still strength. Ali proved you can lose publicly and still win privately. You can fall physically and still stand morally. You can face pressure and remain unchanged. That is greatness. And maybe that's why, decades later, his name still carries weight. Not just because he floated like a butterfly, not just because he stung like a bee, but because he stood like a mountain, unmoved, unbought, unbroken. So the next time you hear about the fight of the century, remember this. The real fight happened 2 weeks earlier in a quiet room, with no audience, and that is the fight Muhammad Ali truly won. Not with fists, but with principle. Not with speed, but with strength of character. Not with noise, but with silence. And sometimes, silence is the loudest victory of all.